Welcome to the Corporate Culture Protest, where we stop protecting toxic leadership and start telling the truth about it. I'm your workplace wellness advocate, and today's episode is uncomfortable but necessary. We're talking about delusional managers, the kind of leaders who believe they are fair while their teams feel targeted, believe people leave for growth while ignoring patterns of resignation, believe performance reviews are accurate while employees feel misrepresented, and focus on small behaviors while completely missing the bigger harm. This is not about one person. This is about a pattern that exists in too many workplaces. And if you're a manager listening, this is not an attack. It's a mirror. I am joined by my wonderful co-hosts, Dr. Chippo and Jenna. Hello to the both of you.
Hi, how are
Hi,
you?
Arthur.
Hi, guys. So we're just going to jump straight into it, okay? We're going to talk about performance reviews and what happens when performance becomes a narrative and not the truth. They're meant to reflect reality, but in many workplaces, they reflect opinion, bias, or control. Jenna, can you tell us what happens when someone's actual work doesn't match the story being told about them?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Very, very important question and a very important topic as well. The first one and obvious one, of course, is self-doubt and feeling confused because there's this mismatch between what you think the company wants and then the feedback you get. And that can naturally create high levels of anxiety to the point where you start questioning your ability and just your general strengths. And so when this mismatch happens, the natural consequence, of course, is you start to lose trust in the manager. You start to feel undervalued or not recognized, or you don't know what your value is because you're confused about what your role entails. Uh, because of this, you can stop speaking up. You're persistently anxious all the time, even to the point of decreased motivation, because you're just constantly thinking, when will I ever do something right? And so when all that happens, the consequence starts to be things like emotional withdrawal. Um, you start to think nothing I do matters. You don't feel safe in the workplace anymore, psychologically, that is. And of course, the one that worries me the most, Erica and Dr. Chipo, is that you may internalize the negative narrative. In other words,
Mm,
you start to believe what your manager
mm,
tells you, even though you start to think they're right all the time and thinking, well, maybe I am useless, maybe I am bad, maybe I'm not, and that becomes your narrative. So the net result of that is that your overall sort of professional identity can become destabilized. And the unfortunate thing with that is even if you then go to another job, that mentality might remain. And that's the concerning part.
mm,
Well, there's a lot of truth in that. And I feel as well, some people might take it as reputational damage because the document says something, but you're doing something completely different. So that
Exactly.
narrative, yeah, it's I think it's worrying to believe that if you're doing your best and your manager is relying on your performance review and you don't know where that performance review ends up, but you know it's used for your increases and promotions,
mm,
etc.
Mm.
mm.
That's actually quite scary. Dr. Chopo, your views.
No, it is. I think it sounds like Jenna, you're in my head because I've even noted that the point on internalization of feedback, how it then creates a sense of being in a moment where disciplinary power is enacted on the individual. So instead
Mm.
then of there being, let's say, an overarching power that's looking down on you, the moment internalization of that feedback happens, we end up in a situation or a scenario where somebody then starts to do what is self surveillance, right? So now that second guessing of oneself, the whole idea of then maybe altering the way you show up at work, as you're saying, that it sometimes can lead to decreased motivation, right? It all speaks
Mm.
to the idea of disciplinary power, because now it's not even going to take, it doesn't even take having somebody watching you or keeping an eye on you or keeping tabs on you for you to feel somehow and show up in a certain way in the workplace. So you find that it becomes then problematic when we have such situations, because it takes one moment to have a performance review that can just derail your whole progress for the whole year and get you to second guess and get you to think you're being undermined or you're underperforming or you're not showing up at your best at the
Mm.
job. So you find that it then becomes problematic, because disciplinary power in that sense now becomes something that forever then controls the way you show up in the workplace. So it's not that you need to have performance reviews every other first, second quarter or every other second, third month, but somehow if then the performance review as it happens, when it happens, has a negative impact or has negative outcomes, it changes the whole narrative for the employee, because now there's a lot going on, there's a lot that you're processing to a point where it can derail how you show up for work to an extent where you are not giving it your best, because now there's always that sense of, or maybe, or what if I get called out for something else, or what if I do something then it's not approved, or I'm called out to be out of line, then what, then. So for overthinkers, I think also I'm one to be an overthinker myself. So if I'm then to get a performance review that derails my thinking process to thinking that I'm not performing at my best, I shut down. I shut down.
Mm.
And sometimes, like you're saying, that the narrative doesn't match the effort that is being put into the work. So you find that we have that discrepancy where what's appearing on paper and the reality of the amount of time, effort, energy, commitment put into the work, there is a mismatch there. And you find that at the
Mm.
end of the day, it's usually the employee who misses out. It's usually the employee who's now operating from a place of disadvantage based on the narrative that is created, or the kind of discourse that then gets created from the performance reviews that are put out there.
Mm. Spot on. So lower expectations means lower performance. That's the net result, Erica.
That's correct. It would lower performance because you're second guessing yourself. You're doubting everything that you do, and then you
Mm.
demotivate it. So how is that productive at the end of the day?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about the pattern of resignations and how managers refuse to see that there's a pattern because it happens over and over again. People leave one after the other, and leadership says they found better opportunities or they wanted growth. Dr. Chipper, what's actually happening here?
Yeah. I think for me, there's a moment where you can actually sense or say that they know what they're doing, but because it gets to a place where it's a power play. There's no way when managers know that they are in the wrong, they would want to take accountability, because that on its own kind of discredits them as individuals. So to stay in that position where they think they still have that control and power and how they can control the situation, they would rather hide behind saying that there's nothing going on and be in that delusional state of thinking all is well, we're executing our roles well, but knowing full well that there's something that is missing and there's something that they're doing wrong in the workplace. So I think for more than anything, it's everything to do with power. It's everything to do with then, if you are to admit that you are in the wrong as the manager, it somehow
Mm.
appears as if you're weak for most people. And in a situation, maybe let me maybe use an example of saying, maybe if the manager is male, you know, the power dynamic, the power play that happens in the workplace, or owing to patriarchy, there's a sense of which uh, admitting to those failures would come across as being weak. And it's a stereotype that most men do not identify with. It's a stereotype that most men want to run away from. But what's wrong then is that it's not taking accountability is not a sign of weakness. For me, taking accountability is actually a sign of bravery and a sign of courage and a sign of growth. Because the moment you can self-reflect and see where you've gone wrong and acknowledge and take accountability and make changes to your behavior, then we are going somewhere. But the moment you do not want to take accountability, the moment you want to project, the moment you want to rationalize and blame the next person, then that's when the vicious cycle of toxicity and bad management continues. But because of the societal norms or the societal stereotypes that we've grown in, there's a lot then that then gets linked to our gender and how we show up in places and how accountability is more associated with women than men, and how for men it's a sign of weakness. All of that comes into play. So the moment those decisions get to be made, we're at a place where there's a lot happening that instead of people being accountable for their, excuse the language, shitty behavior, they would rather run away, scapegoat, and find somebody to blame for things that they know they're doing. It's not that they don't know what they're doing. Most managers know they're shitty human beings, but because they operate and stay in their ivory towers, they would rather be there and think they're doing things right than come back to earth and be accountable for their shitty behavior. That's my take on it.
Just to add on that, I mean, you've touched on some of the reasons, but some of the reasons the managers don't take accountability or why this resignation pattern happens is because when you're in these environments, I mean, talking toxic environments, what ends up happening is the manager starts to become insecure. So a strong employee will seem threatening to them. What happens is when you're in a toxic culture for a while, then that culture teaches them to manage this way. So this then becomes your managerial style, and then this style becomes normalized. You see what I'm saying? And so when you have this, you know what I mean? And when you have this office politics, what ends up happening is when you start to protect yourself all the time, you then shift the blame to take narrative away from yourself, because this is what office politics does. It becomes this sort of survival of the fittest culture. And then of course the last two are need for control. What happens is when a manager focuses on mistakes, it gives them a feeling of control. Because when they then telling the employee what to do, it's, I'm feeling more in control now. And so what ends up happening is they may avoid praising or admit or admit employees are doing well because, like you were saying earlier, it makes them look weaker. So the moment they're critiquing, it gives them some kind of sense of superiority. But a lot of that is the insecurity, A, and B, the toxic environment, meaning I've got to protect my job. So I've got to show some authority. So it comes from a place, but it's obviously a toxic place.
Oh, wow. That's terrible. Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense though. And I
Yeah.
feel also it's you're saying it's the ego of the toxic manager that won't allow them to take that accountability, that won't allow them to reflect and want to rebuild their team. They'd rather continue to break it down.
And the thing is, when you then, what the opposite of that type of managerial style is obviously a manager who has EQ. So the problem is that when you're in that state of mind, you're not going to then see employees who are starting to disengage or emotionally withdraw or start to feel helpless or start to detach because you're thinking A, about yourself, and your motive is control, not connection. So you're not going to see when employees start to detach emotionally, which means you have a breeding ground for high resignation.
Wow. True.
Yep.
So if people keep leaving your team, it's not coincidence, it's not bad luck, it's not just growth, it's feedback. And ignoring that feedback is a choice. Let's
Yeah.
talk about what delusional leadership looks like day to day. Instead of addressing real issues, and I think we've touched on this, they focus on things that don't really matter. Timekeeping, tone, small behaviors taken out of context. But Jenna, why does this happen?
I mean, similar to previous comments, it's put it this way, and Dr. Chipo touched on this as well, is the issue of negativity bias. In other words, the common trend I've seen throughout is that good is expected and bad is pounced upon. So when you're in this culture of A, survival, B, obsessing with spreadsheets and numbers, and satisfying stakeholders, then it becomes easier or it becomes instinctive to spot problems than recognize good work. Because naturally you're going to filter the negative stuff so you can stay afloat. And that's what happens. So one of the reasons for that is that negative bias. Um, Obviously, I said that the office politics. So when people are in that frame of mind of toxicity, which they know they're in, they'll then shift the blame to which helps them, which makes them go into self-preservation. And 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 uh, and of course, when you in that frame of mind, your communication becomes poor because you don't see the employee as human. You see them as a pawn, like a piece on a chessboard that has to fulfill an agenda. And so naturally, your communication style is going to come across as distant, cold, um, almost like you're a product on an assembly line in a factory, um, because of how they see you in a company. How it's almost like you credit to capitalism, but they don't see the human being, and that's why it affects that. That's why I said the heart of it is this poor EQ, and then you can see it in the way that they manage.
True.
Yeah.
And maybe just to add on to that, Jenna, I think also, like you mentioned, the managers then get to a place where they don't see employees or acknowledge, like you're saying, they don't acknowledge them as human, right? It
Right.
also ties in with not acknowledging them as sources of knowledge or sources of information that could be useful to try and
Mm.
transform and provide a better working space. So I think for me as well, the idea that whoever is at the top, the moment you cannot self-reflect and understand that knowledge moves in both directions, then there's a crisis. Because anything, anybody who is in a subordinate position to you says something that makes sense. You are not able to acknowledge or take that into consideration, because if you're so narrow-minded to think that power only moves in one direction, knowledge only moves in direction, it becomes a problem, because you find that in some cases managers take personally things that employees say, and they tend to personalize those things without and think it's an attack on their character, when sometimes in certain moments it's not an attack on you as a person, but it's just something that you need to look at, to acknowledge whatever it is that somebody or your subordinate wants to point out. Just because people are employees and you are in a position of power over them doesn't necessarily mean that they can't think and they're not at the same level or could reach the same level as you in your position of being the leader. So you find that the moment then somebody who's deemed to be a subordinate says something that would be valid in some cases, you find that there's that element of personalizing things, looking at things as personal attacks, and thinking that there's a subversion of power, because traditionally we've always been conditioned to think that power moves in one direction. So if you're supposed to be the leader, you're supposed to be the be all and all source of information and knowledge. Yeah. So the moment
Mhm.
then you find that your employees come to the party with ideas that make sense and
Mhm.
contributions that can be positive in some cases, it's problematic for some individuals to acknowledge and accept that knowledge can move in both directions. So I think the moment when then you personalize and take suggestions as personal attacks, that's where the danger is for me.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's how we end up with delusional leaders who think that they are the be all end all, the fountain of knowledge. Everybody else around them cannot be considered as a legit or authentic voices of authority or voices of knowledge, which is not the case. That's not the case. But because of how most of our leaders are, how do I even put it? In inducted into their positions, they think that knowledge is meant and only supposed to move in one direction.
Well, yeah, that sounds very true, actually, if you have to really sit back and think about it. Um, let's be honest, if we're focusing on small behaviors while your team feels unsupported, unheard, or unsafe, you're not managing performance. You're avoiding responsibility. Now let's talk about something that doesn't always get named, but it's very big: psychological safety. When employees feel they cannot question decisions or voice opinions, or feel like their experience is dismissed, I feel that's not discomfort, it's harm. Jenna, maybe you can elaborate for us on psychological well-being.
Well, what I've noticed is that when you're at the height of these feelings of unsafety, a common symptom, or not symptom, but kind of behavior is this constant self-monitoring, whether it's how you look, whether it's how you talk, the way you write in an email, anything. It's that constant that vigilant self-monitoring. I've noticed that to be highly prevalent. And of course, that even shows itself in fear of speaking up when you're in meetings and you even monitor how you say stuff and just your tone, that kind of thing. Uh, Fear of making mistakes. And of course, when you're afraid to make mistakes, you're not going to try things or you're not going to innovate or be
Yeah.
creative.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing. And then obviously you're afraid of being misunderstood, and then you start socially withdrawing because it just becomes about you. The thing with the psychological safety is that it starts to mutate into other things. So it starts with maybe your performance, and then it impacts the way you socialize. It impacts the way you manage your time. It impacts the way you listen because you may get distracted easily in meetings. So it starts to mutate into different areas. And so all this results into a kind of shift into survival mode. And when other people cotton on to how you feel and they also experience this culture, then you have a breakdown of team morale. And that's where the team culture starts to slide. Because it's not just you now, other people pick it up as well. So that starts to happen, and it's because of that lack of psychological safety.
Mm. Mm.
Dr. Chippo, do you have anything to add?
I think maybe just to add on to say, I think also in addition to what Jenna has just said, the other problem that we're experiencing in the workplace is that our managers, our leaders are not showing up in in their humanity. I don't know if that makes sense. They are showing up as emotionless robots that are just there for the work and needs to have everybody in the factory line, like Jenna was saying. They are lacking the emotional capability or capacity to understand that at the end of the day, employees are human. We are human before we are anything. And for that reason, we do not switch on and off emotions, and we do not operate from a place where we don't feel the impact of their actions as leaders. So I think that's where some of the problems emanate from, because the moment they are so disconnected from their teams, disconnected from their employees, because they don't want to show up as in their humanity, it takes away a lot from the team. That disconnect, the moment where they sense or think that sitting down with employees to find out if they're okay, what's going on, what where they are at with their work, makes them look as if they are weak, because they want to portray the idea of being what the iron fisted people in charge. It takes away then an environment where we can all show up in our humanity and understand that emotions happen, things happen, and we all go through things in the workplace. So I think that disconnect is also at the heart of the crisis that we are facing, because the moment then somebody breaks down in their emotions because they're triggered by something, if you are then a leader who shows up without any sense of understanding that you need to check in with your employees, you need to be connected to your people, that's the moment where then in your delusion you are shocked when suddenly 5 people want to resign at the same time, and you find in some cases they actually become angry and say it's everything wrong with people leaving instead of them and how they are operating and reinforcing and perpetuating a toxic environment. So you find when that happens, then yeah, for me, the problem begins with that disconnect from employees. We are all humans, we are all people, we are mothers, we are fathers in the workplaces before we are or before we should be perceived as robots that are just supposed to do 9 to 5 without even taking a break or experiencing or feeling or sitting in the kinds of emotions and triggers and everything that we go through in the workplace.
Yeah, that's a lot to take in. So I'm going to wrap up. Delusional leadership is not loud. It's quiet, subtle, and consistent. It shows up in misaligned feedback, ignored patterns, dismissed concerns, and a refusal to reflect. But here's the opportunity. Awareness changes everything. If you're a leader listening to this, ask yourself honestly, are people growing under you or are they leaving you? Because the answer to this question is your leadership report. If your team keeps resigning, stop explaining it away and start listening to what it's trying to tell you. Until next time, protect your energy, honor your worth. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.